States. It's Mark from the United States.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, Mark from the States. How are we doing today? I am doing fantastic. I hope you are as well. Thank you so much for coming back for part 2 of Caretakers and the secret of rescuing World War II airmen and these gardeners. Just an incredible bunch of people. Like I mentioned in the first part, if you haven't seen it, go watch that. You learn some stories about these two guys. One made it through the war, one didn't. And it's just, he didn't really even think that there would be someone who would stick around just so they can be a gardener of a cemetery. But the meaning is more deep than that, of course. But I mean, when you have the war right on your front door, some were ordered to stay there, and they followed orders and stuck around, and a lot of them were captured, and some unfortunately were executed, and some of the graves were disrespected. I imagine a lot. I still believe that a lot probably were given the respect that they, being soldiers and the camaraderie, that sort of thing, that they wouldn't do it. But you're always going to have stories of bad things happening as well. So that was unfortunate to hear that. But just incredible, I mean, they're not fighting. They're just here essentially leftover from, a lot of them were from the First World War. And it's just kind of really tears at you to hear why are they being tortured and killed because of why. So war, you can never really understand it, I guess. Please go support Paul over at World War II. It's really, really important that you do. World War II TV links, of course, to the channel and to this video will be in the description. I encourage you to get over there and just help out a little bit. One like, subscribe to the channel if you don't. Just really goes a long way, and it's important. And it's important for them. We need the original content for us to learn from, and these guys do incredible work. So thank you, Paul, and thank you to all of you who are going to go over there and help and support his channel. Come sit down on this big fake couch. Let's get into part 2. We'll probably finish it up today. It'll be a little bit longer than yesterday, I imagine. Cooper is, or was, by the time you see this, in Dublin. Or on their way to Dublin, I guess. They just finished up in Waterford and the Medieval Museum and a couple other things. And I think he was getting on a bus to Dublin or something like that. And they're going to go see St. Patrick's Cathedral and a bunch of other things. So I'm excited for him. But more on him later in another video when I get more information. He's not being so forthcoming. I'm getting a lot of photos of him waking up and what he looks like in the morning, because he likes to sleep in, and he only can do so much during the day because things have open and close hours. So you got to get moving. As soon as they open, you got to be there. So a lot of early mornings, I guess, so far for him. So but I'm loving it. He's having a good time. So yeah, come sit with me. Let's get into part 2 and see what happens next.
I also want to tell a little bit about Rosine Witten. So Rosine was born in Arras. She was a local, and she owned a Café Tabac, like a little corner store that was right between the Wargraves office and the Wargraves workshop. So if you've ever been to Arras or to the CWGC experience in Boran, where you can see the carpenters and the stonemasons, her office was her store was right near there. And so, she met many of these men. She was a child refugee during the First World War. Her family had to leave Arras, but they came back and they helped with the rebuilding. And she eventually married a war gardener named Bert Whitten, who was from London and was an RAF veteran. So he was one of the guys who was arrested and sent to the internment camp. But Rosine stayed behind in Arras, and she helped many, many airmen. She was a senior guide on the Comet Line, which is one of the, one of the big escape lines in this.
Comet Line.
And actually, it's so funny. I was watching Masters of the Air, and there was someone, I was like, I know that person's name. Why do I know that person's name? And I looked, and I was like, oh, he's one of the guys that Rosine Whitten helped after he had been shot down. So Roy Claytor. Who's, a cast named person in Masters of the Air. I was like, where is that name familiar to me? But yeah, he was one of the guys that she helped. And these are two of the others, Doug Hohen, who's US, and Alfie Martin, RAF. She kept them in her house, and then she brought them to Paris on the train, where she worked with the Comet Line.
And it makes complete sense that these staff members, she's a cafe owner, but they would have exactly the kind of knowledge that we need, the bilingual, know the roads, know how to travel between places. Because, we all know that there are lots of places in rural France where the locals just didn't travel. They didn't necessarily know how to travel across the sides of the country, because that's not what your life consisted of. You're a French farmer. A long trip was 5 miles to market once a month or something. So I've never been telling your book. I never thought about the fact that these people have all the skill sets that are incredibly useful at this time.
Wow.
Absolutely. The bilingual thing was absolutely essential. So many of the wives and the teenage children who were not interned helped with interrogating people, because you had to make sure that the airman was authentic.
Who he was, yeah.
And you're absolutely right about sort of that network, right? Because they were people who had community. They had been together for, they would have like British Legion events and commemoration. So their community, they knew people in a wide,
an extended community rather than a small kind of local community. Exactly. Just by the definition of the fact that they traveled around these cemeteries, they would know people in multiple villages, multiple towns. They'd know probably the bus routes, the train routes, and it's it sounds like it should be something that everybody knew, but it's it's not back that time. It's people knew the little world they lived in.
Absolutely. And it sort of created this sort of invisible map, right, of these connections. The first photo that I showed of the tool house at Sayre Road number 2, the American airman who stayed there, George Simler, who that photo was for, Ben Leach helped him, but then he passed him on to the wife of another CWGC person, Irma Palin, who lived a few towns over. And then she passed him on to Arthur Richards, who was the president of the British Legion in Arras, who wasn't in a camp because he was older. And he was a big hub of collecting information, making false documents, because they had this network that extended from the towns all the way out into all of these small villages. And they all knew each other and trusted each other, which was, of course, such an important part of any resistance movement, was knowing who you could trust. And they knew that these families, these Anglo-French families that, were very committed to the alliance, very committed to each other, they knew they could trust them. And so that was essential.
Ian sort of made a question/stroke comment about perhaps the Germans will be largely inclined to ignore the Allied cemeteries, making them fairly safe to hide prisoners, because we know that when the Germans occupy lots of French towns, of course they would take down the French flags and put their own flags up and turn their buildings into administrative areas, things like that. But they would have known the French have a very particular respect for cemeteries. You talk about All Saints Day and flowers. So I would imagine, from what I know in Normandy, they would be very careful to kind of not just piss off the locals by, parking their tanks over graves, either French graves or Commonwealth graves, because it would just anger the locals. So is there some truth to the fact that Germans would tend to avoid the cemeteries?
Yeah, they did tend to, or just visit them as a visitor. Right. You'd see a lot of, especially the cemeteries that had German graves in them. You'd see a lot of that. And also because of in part because of Hitler's, repeated trips to First World War sites,
Yeah.
that became sort of an approved activity for young soldiers in France. France was already seen for German soldiers as sort of a light posting. And so it was really common for officers to take groups of young soldiers out on these outings to places like Thiepval or the Menengate. And so if you look at ordinary German soldiers' photo albums, there are very often photos of them in some of these cemeteries or at these memorials, because it was seen as sort of like an acceptable activity that an officer would be in charge of, rather than whatever other things they might get up to on their own time. So Ben Leach does talk a little bit in his diary about meeting German soldiers in cemeteries, and the only time he says that anyone did any damage, other than right at the beginning, of course, there were some, the Germans did take down some monuments, right? Did take down like the Australian monument at Mont Saint-Quentin, and some of the other monuments that they found objectionable. They did take those down. And Ben Leach does talk about visiting those sites and seeing the ruined monuments. But in the cemeteries themselves, the only time he talks about damage is there was one German soldier who got drunk and fired his gun into one of those little chapels, like into the ceiling, and all the plaster fell down and injured him. And after that, the local Germans in Beaumont Hamel mostly, left the cemetery alone. Yeah.
This is really fascinating, and it's presenting that we did a show where we talked about the travel actually increases in some parts of the world in World War II, and of course for some of these German soldiers, their fathers, their uncles would have served in those same areas in World War II, so they're doing war tourism like people do war tourism today. It's weird to think that would be happening in the middle of a war, but I mean, I guess it did.
Wow.
I guess you're posted somewhere. As you say, you've got leave as a German soldier. Why not investigate and look at what had happened a generation before? It sounds odd, but it isn't odd when you think about it.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. War tourism happening during the war.
War tourism.
That's brilliant stuff. I can't tell you how much I'm enjoying this.
Well, Rosine Witten, eventually there was a crackdown in Arras and she had to move to Paris, but she kept working for many months. She was a senior guide on the Comet Line. She trained other guides. She had many aliases, and eventually, so she lived at Comet Line headquarters in Paris, and eventually that was raided and she was arrested. And she was sent to Ravensbrück, the concentration camp for women in Germany, and then later sent to a sub camp as a slave laborer. So she worked in a munitions factory, sort of ironically, making anti-aircraft munitions in this sub camp. But she did survive the war. She was badly wounded in the camp. Someone who was working near her, their job was to take defective shells and break them down into component parts so that they could salvage any part of the shell that was still usable. And obviously that was very dangerous. And someone near her, the shells exploded and killed that worker. And Rosine Witten was badly injured and had, lifelong disabilities from that, and from being in the camp and starving and, all the other deprivations that go with being a concentration camp prisoner.
Wow.
This is her uniform, which is on view in a small museum on the Somme. So if you're ever around Beaumont Hamel and you visit Avril Williams Museum in Auchinvillers, there's Rosine Witten's uniform is there. She didn't have any children. She gave the uniform to a local historian.
Right.
And her husband, if you look in this array, her husband is the first one, number 304. That's her husband, Bert.
Oh, wow.
So he was in the internment camp. Most of the prisoners were exchanged in September 1944, but there was a mix-up in the number of prisoners in the exchange, and they ended up having to leave off 2 people, and they just went alphabetical. So last name Witten and last name Young were left behind, and so he wasn't repatriated to the UK until March 1945. So
way.
Very late in the war.
We had a question from Ian earlier about which route were they when the exchange happened. Which route did they go via?
Yeah, so in the fall of 1943, they were sent from Tostes to a different camp in France. And from that camp in France, they were sent to Sweden and then repatriated from Sweden to the UK.
Right.
So
Thank you.
yeah. So I think they landed in Liverpool in September 1944. Yeah, but not Bert. Bert was still left behind, and he didn't get back until March 1945.
That's crazy.
He went directly into the hospital. He was ill, and he had an operation, and he never recovered from the operation. So he died in the hospital in August 1945, just a couple of days after BJ Day. So Rosine was able to bring his body back to Arras. They're buried in her family plot in the Arras Communal Cemetery. He doesn't have a CWGC headstone. The rules about who counts as a civilian victim of the war are a little bit fuzzy. You know, if he had died in the camp, he would definitely be on the Roll of Honor. But since he died after he had been repatriated, he's not.
Ridiculous.
Could a case be made that he could be on it? Maybe. But you'll see that on the grave that Rosine made sure that it says IWGC on his, and that his line is in English, not in French.
Yeah.
Next to her name, you'll notice 47. Some of her many medals. So she got, she was a Officer of the Legion of Honor. She got the American Congressional Medal of Freedom, all of the British awards. These I think are just her French medals next to her name. But she lived until 1995 and actually worked. She was a stewardess on the Cross Channel Ferry for many years. So if you took the ferry in the 60s or 70s, you might have met her without knowing. She was.
What a history.
Yeah.
What a life. Incredible.
But I did want to sort of come back to sort of the June 1944 moment and Ben Leach, because I know that it's
That's
June.
What we're covering. Yeah,
exactly. So June 1944. So a slightly post D-Day story. So this story takes place on June 27th, 1944. So 3 weeks after D-Day. And it involves this tool shed and this guy. So this is Brigadier General Arthur Vanneman. He's the chief of intelligence of the 8th Air Force. So the 8th Air Force, the force that's stationed in England, sending over bombers, all of that. And Arthur Vanneman he's the chief of intelligence for the whole 8th Air Force. He's briefed on everything. He's briefed on Ultra. He has all of the information. But he decides that his men won't respect him unless he's been on combat missions. And so he decides that he's going to go on 5 combat missions as an observer, which is the number that you need to get an air medal. And so then he'll have the air medal. And so then when he's talking to people, they'll see he has the air medal and they'll know that he's been on these combat missions. And he got permission from Jimmy Doolittle, his commanding officer, to do this. And so 3 weeks after D-Day, he's on a B-17 with these guys. So this is the crew of a B-17 called Big Barn Smell. And, your regular U.S. 8th Air Force guys, including this guy, who's Donald Rentschler from Indiana. And what happens on this trip, they're just supposed to go and bomb a V-1 rocket site in northern France and come right home. But as you might imagine, since I'm telling you this story, that doesn't go to plan. They're hit by flak, the engine's on fire, the pilot tells everyone to bail out. And so 5 of them are able to bail out. The general bails out, Donald Rentschler, the navigator, and the bombardier, and 2 others. So there are 5 on the ground and 5 in the plane. And then the fire in the engine goes out and the plane recovers.
Oh my God.
The pilot is able to get back to the UK. And I was able to talk to his sons, and they gave me an unpublished memoir that he wrote about, and a lot of it is about sort of this trip back without the general, and sort of calling to the tower. What does he say to the tower? Right? He says, I want to land right away. God. And they say, do you have wounded on board? And he says, no, I don't. And they said, well, just wait your turn, just circle. And he has to tell them something's wrong, but he doesn't want to say anything over the open channel, right? He doesn't want to say anything, that could get anyone in trouble. And so he finally says to them, I am the only officer on board. And they take a minute, and then he says, the headphones vibrated away from my head. As they said, what did you say? And they bring him in for the landing. And so he had left Arthur Vanneman, the chief of intelligence, on the ground in France.
Oh my gosh.
So on
And
the ground,
the sidebar has gone, wild about what a stupid idea to let a guy with all that security clearance go there just so he can get a medal.
Right.
Don't want to speak ill of the guy, but potentially, as Great Dominion says, a really bad idea to let a guy like that fly over enemy territory. So, that's the consensus in the sidebar.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Jimmy Doolittle himself had flown on D-Day, right?
True.
And his own
and
Doolittle
so he was
raid.
someone who was inclined to give this sort of permission. One thing that I looked for a lot that I wasn't able to find a good quote about, but so after this happened, Lord Tedder took Jimmy Doolittle into an office for 2 hours and just shouted at him. And I looked in Tedder's memoirs and everything, but this was still secret when a lot of these people were writing about it. So I didn't get any specifics about what was said in that meeting, but I imagine nothing good.
2 hours is quite a lengthy reprimand.
He got chewed out for sure.
Yes.
What are you doing?
RAF was
what a come down for Doolittle. I mean, we've done it on talked about Doolittle on the channel before. I mean, he was in 42 post the Doolittle raid. I mean, he was rising riding a crest of fame that the 2024 can't understand, but in the US particularly, and then now he's being reprimanded for this. It's amazing how things change. But fascinating story.
Yeah.
You always.
So
that's the thing. You always have a boss. It always seems like there's a guy above you. So no matter what trajectory you're going, you're still gonna have someone above you. Hilarious. But yeah, that is, I can't believe that is. I just got to take a moment to just kind of let that soak in. The plane was on fire. They didn't think they were going to make it. They thought it was going down. They told people to get out. Half the aircraft got out, and then the flame went out, and they were able to keep flying. Oh my God. I wonder what their thoughts was watching the plane just keep going and not have to crash land. And they're like, what the heck?
Vanneman's on the ground. Mm-hmm. He's a brigadier general, and he's picked up. They land in a tiny little village. And, so the local people who are, there's like a German captain in charge, and they bring him to the local, to the mayor's office. They're not even a jail in these places. And so they're interrogating him. They don't know that he speaks German. So Vanneman was actually the U.S. Air Force attaché to Berlin from 1937 to 1941. So he had met all of the Nazi high command. He had met all of the aircraft manufacturers. He spoke German. So he could hear what they were saying. And they were very confused because he was saying he was a brigadier general. And they're like, well, that doesn't make any sense. And then he was saying, I was in a plane that was shot down. And they're like, no plane crashed. So they're very confused about what's going on. And so they eventually just send him off first to a hospital in Frankfurt because he was injured in the jump, and then later to Stalag Luft 3, not trusting anything that he said. Like, they didn't even really interrogate him very closely because they thought that he was there to give misinformation. And when he got to Stalag Luft 3, the prisoners there thought that he was there to arrange an escape, which he also was not. So he disappointed them as well. But the other 4 guys who were in the plane and landed in these little villages on the Somme were helped by Ben Leach and this network of CWGC gardeners and their friends and neighbors. So
cool.
Donald Rentschler, the navigator here, this is just a clip from his escape and evasion report. So when they got back to the UK, they had to go through an interrogation and give a report about what happened to them. And so he's writing about how the English gardener from the military cemetery helped him, and they've got Ben Leach's name in the margins there. So Donald Rentschler and the other guys from the plane were in Beaumont Hamel and the surrounding villages for weeks. And part of the thing about D-Day was that all of the escape lines were broken. right? Because trains are not running anymore. You know, a lot of airmen are actually joining resistance forces and fighting in a different way. But there's no way to get them out. And so what's happening on the Somme in June of 1944 is just this elaborate shell game of moving these evaders around from one place to another as the Germans, you know, and this is, it is incredible to me, the amount of effort the Germans put into trying to find these guys, even in June and July of 1944, like they're, you know, they're sending manpower to look for these guys. And so they have to keep moving them. And one of the places that they use is the tool shed at Sierra Road Cemetery number 2. And Donald Rentschler actually also, he spends some time there in the cemetery, but he also spends 6 nights at the Newfoundland Memorial Park in Beaumont.
Wow.
So if you know the caribou and the old trenches there. So there was an incident where a local resistance person who actually did work for the CWGC as a French laborer, a guy named René Mouchemble, was shot by the Nazis in July 1944. And that made everyone very nervous. So a lot of people who had been hosting stopped hosting, and Ben Leach had all of these airmen on his hands and he didn't have anywhere to put them. So Donald Rentschler and an RAF guy ended up in the trenches at the Newfoundland Memorial Park for 6 nights before he could move them along to somewhere a little bit safer.
Wow.
Yeah. This is some of them at the Liberation. This is several of these. I mean, these are, you know, Americans and RAF guys and everything, but 2 of the guys in here are from that plane. And they were staying with a woman whose husband was a photographer. So she took this photo, or he took the photo of them all on, I think this is September 2nd, 1944, with the liberation of Lille. And I really love the little dog in the front who looks very alarmed because they must have been shouting. They must have been shouting really loud while they were taking the photo, because the dog looks pretty startled.
It does, yeah.
So that's the book. I mean, in the book, I do get a lot more into sort of the interwar community of the gardeners, sort of how they formed a union, how they were compensated, all of sort of that sort of thing. But I'm happy to answer if there are any more questions about either about the gardeners or about their experience in World War II.
Yeah, we've got a couple already. So, you know, you've given us a handful of stories. So some were interned, some were helping the resistance. I mean, did some of the gardeners just were able to kind of keep under the radar and keep on working anyway, and just sort of not annoy the Germans?
Yeah, so there were a few who did, mostly who were Irish, right? So there were a couple of other Irish gardeners who...
We learned that in the first one. Yeah, the first guy that she talked about was Irish, and because of their status of, you know, with the war, they kind of were generally left alone.
You know, once I actually looked into it, they did sort of help the resistance, but in a much quieter way than Bob Armstrong, who just managed to get along. There were also 2 gardeners who hid in attics throughout the whole occupation. And
is there kind of a rule of thumb as to what happened to the cemeteries without their staff? Did some of the local French mow the grass? Were they kind of left? You know, is there a particular set idea of what happened?
Yeah. So in the spring of 1941, so a whole year into the occupation, the cemeteries were starting to get pretty scraggly. And the mayors didn't like that, and the French government didn't like that. So what they did was the Vichy government provided a small amount of money to mayors and said that the mayors should hire local people to take care of the cemeteries. They very often hired the wives or the sons, or in some cases the daughters, of gardeners to do this work, because otherwise the people were on public assistance, and they said, okay, well, we have this money, you know, it's your cemetery, you take care of it, we'll pay you this little bit of money. The standard of care for the cemeteries was never up to Ben Leach's standards.
Sure.
He often complains, and, you know, sometimes he was sometimes able to get a letter back to the IWGC in London through like Swiss or American diplomatic channels. And so there are letters from him complaining about, you know, the standard of care in the cemeteries, how they're not up to standard, like all of that.
That's funny.
Gardeners, gardeners and their rose bushes and things. We
Yeah,
all know a
gardeners
few
are gonna
obsessed,
garden.
gardeners, and it's all the better for it, I guess. No, it's fascinating. So we've got some more questions. So obviously, one of the things that you said you expanded on the book is the families, the extended families, because you then have a little network, and the gardeners themselves, a lot are interred for the war, but they've got wives, they've got children. Some of the children, I guess, will be adults, and some wouldn't. So Ian is asking, how closely did the Germans watch these Anglo-French families? I mean, were they treated the same as everybody else, or was there an extra level of suspicion because those people have contacts with the enemy?
Sure.
Yeah, they were quite closely watched in many circumstances. So a few of the wives were interned, especially the British-born wives, but a few of the French-born wives were also interned, although usually briefly and usually in France, not in Germany. That's not a hard and fast rule. There are many exceptions to that. But yeah, they were watched. And some of them, one of the ways that they kept tabs on them was making them check in with the local authorities every week. So there's this one woman in Armentières named Lucy Hollingdale, and she writes about how she lived in a smaller town, and she had to go into Lille every Wednesday to report to the gendarmes in Lille, just to check in and be like, I'm here. And she talks about how she used those trips into Lille to make contact with her resistance network at a cafe that was near the mayor's office, and that's when they would give her the clandestine pamphlets to bring back out into the countryside.
Wow.
So she was actually using her check-ins as a way to say, because foreign nationals were not allowed to go more than 5 kilometers from their houses without a pass, without permission.
Yeah.
And so her having to go into Lille actually facilitated her having a reason to be on the road with her bicycle. Yeah. And lots of other families participated in other ways. There's one teenage son who actually joins the communist resistance, and is in a big firefight a few weeks after D-Day. He was captured, deported, and died in a concentration camp as well.
Wow, so many amazing stories. And another question from Ian Carr this time: did some go back to being gardeners again post-war? I mean, I'm assuming some did, but some felt that maybe they do something a bit safer away from there. So what was the percentage that went back, possibly?
Yeah, so many of them did go back after.
I was going to say, definitely, a lot of them did. I mean, if you're willing to go through what you love what you do, you are honored to do what you do. There's a sense of purpose there, and I imagined a lot of them did go back.
The war, so there's a big difference between the people who evacuated to the UK and the people who were still in Europe, either interned or free. A lot of the people who were in the UK, especially if their families had gotten out with them, many of them did decide to stay in the UK afterward. They were just like, post-war France was not an easy place to be. They had already done the post-war thing once, right? They had been there in the aftermath of the First World War. And so many of the people who evacuated did decide to stay in the UK. But most of the people who were still in Europe did decide to go back to the commission. In fact, in sort of the fall of 1944 and the winter of 1945, the commission was trying to get back on its feet, trying to send officers back to France. And what they found when they finally got officers back on the ground was that there were 60 men already working in the cemeteries, right? That they had come back. Some of them had come out of hiding. There were also a few of them at another camp at Saint-Denis in Paris. So some of the gardeners who were farther south in the just geographically were sent to Saint-Denis instead of to Illegate-Tost. And so they were liberated in August 1944 when the Allies got to Paris. And most of them just went back home and started working even before the commission was sort of officially back and officially paying them.
Well, thank you for that. And I can't help thinking myself about what these people, their experiences of this bilingual mixed marriage type, because that's basically what I'm living in right now. I'm a Brit living with a French lady, and my stepkids are French, but they have a British stepfather, and that is something we don't necessarily think of as happening in the 1920s and 30s. But Europe was very cosmopolitan. There were all sorts of different people living in places like Paris and Lisbon, and Berlin, of course, was famously very cosmopolitan international. So this group of gardeners had real insight into those day-to-day dilemmas of where does your loyalty lie. You've got a job that's more of a job. It's a vocation. You're looking, they're, as you said, they're veterans of the First World War themselves. They're looking after the graves of their comrades, their friends, and that's a duty. It's not a kind of a clocking in, clocking out kind of job. And so they've got that loyalty, but they've also got loyalty to the country that they are nationals of. They've got community around where they are. It's lots of things to consider. I wonder what they would have been thinking as in the 1930s, that Germany is showing that signs of becoming as we know it became the Third Reich and Hitler, and looking to go on a war footing. What experiences they'd have been through, and how many dilemmas they faced at that time. Was there much source material for you to look at?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's such a good point, and especially since we don't often think about those small French villages like on the Somme as being cosmopolitan places.
Yeah.
But one of the things that I had to do was read a lot of census records from those places. And what you'll notice is before the First World War, you can read the censuses for every village on the Somme battlefields and never find a foreign-born person. 100% French. Sometimes there's one person in a village who's from Belgium or something, that is the makeup of the villages. After the First World War, that changes completely. So if you look at the census records in like 1931 and before the Second World War, some of those towns, like Thiepval is almost 50% foreign born. Most of the towns are in the sort of 25, 30, sometimes up to 40% foreign born, because these are towns that were completely decimated during the First World War. A lot of the original inhabitants never came back. And France had a really aggressive immigration policy during the 1920s, where they made it much easier for people to come and gain French citizenship with a shorter residency requirement. They also made it so that if French women married foreign nationals, they didn't lose their French citizenship, but that didn't happen until 1927. So it didn't affect most of the gardeners' wives. But so if you look at a place like Beaumont-Hamel or Thiepval or Albert, you look and it's Polish names, Italian names, Lithuanians, Spaniards, so many people from all over Europe are living in these very small towns because of they helped with the rebuilding after World War I and then just stayed. I mean, you do occasionally find. I also read a lot of the escape and invasion reports, and some of my favorites were, you get an American airman who at home spoke Polish or spoke German, because many Americans in that era did speak, were the children of immigrants.
Sure.
And so there are American airmen who evade through France, not by pretending to be French, but by being Polish and speaking Polish to other Polish workers who they meet along the way, because it was these little areas were so cosmopolitan.
This is so fascinating, because it's like in my head, after 1919, there's like a reset button pressed and everything goes back to how it was in 1914. But of course it didn't. The borders have changed. Populations have moved. As you say, people have got connections with other places. The romances, babies have been born. Europe was a very different place. And then again, post-45, it does another a non-reset. It finds its level again with all the new communities that have sprung up and population. So it's fascinating. But you mentioned Americans there. So one last question from Scott Grimwood. Does Caitlin know anything about the US First World War cemeteries in the occupied countries?
Yeah, for sure. So the US had a little bit of a different model for their cemeteries in France. They had an American superintendent who would live there, but they mostly employed local French labor.
Right.
So as opposed to the Imperial War Graves Commission, which employed Commonwealth nationals and then had French workers on sort of like temporary contracts, the US, most of the gardening was done by local French workers. Right. And so during the invasion in 1940, of course, the US was still neutral, but they did evacuate the wives and children of all of the superintendents of the cemeteries. Even if you go to the cemeteries now, the superintendent very often still lives on site. If you go to one of the US World War I cemetery, there's a house there where the superintendent lives. And so they were evacuated, and eventually the superintendents were evacuated as well. But some of them did sustain some incidental battle damage in those first battles in 1940.
How can you not?
Well, that's a brilliant presentation. I've enjoyed every minute of it. I can't wait to bring you back on. I can't wait to decide what kind of weird and wacky and cosmopolitan subject you're going to bring to us next time, because this, as we said at the beginning, overlaps so many different areas, and I've sat spellbound through the whole lot. So folks know what to do. Go and buy the book. Help my guests by buying their books, and help me by becoming a patron or a YouTube channel member.
There you go.
Caitlin, it's been great talking to you. I hope our paths cross again.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much for having me. This has been great.
Thank you. So, folks, I'm back again later on talking about the airborne troop carrier plan for D-Day. So that'll be later on. So cheers, everybody. See you in a few hours' time. This is Paul Winnett for World War II TV saying enjoy the next 2 or 3 hours without me. Cheers, everybody. Bye.
That was awesome. I really, really enjoyed that. It'd be a pretty interesting read, her book, for sure. Yeah, the U.S. cemeteries from World War One. I can't say that I would even have guessed there were like specific cemeteries for that, but it makes sense. I mean, I don't know too much about World War One, so obviously I'm not surprised that that's something I didn't really understand, but it just goes back with the stories of just how these people, granted many with military backgrounds, but just, doing their duty of honor and bravery, and just, taking care of these graves till for some and many, the very end. But just hearing these really is an eye-opener for me, because it's not something that I was really in the know or even thought about. Great video. Please, 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 please go support Paul over at World War II TV. Links will be in the description as always. Thank you so much for coming, and thanks for hanging out and getting through the second part. It's a little bit longer than the first one. Hope everybody's happy, healthy, and safe. We'll be back with another video, so just stay tuned for that. You guys are amazing. Take care, everyone. All right, bye-bye.
Mark from the States, Mark from the States, it's Mark, and he's from